All right, everybody. Welcome to the show. It's the Future of Freedom. I'm Scott Horton here on Liberty.me every Thursday night at 8 o'clock. And it's called the Future of Freedom. The show is because every week I interview Jacob Hornberger, the founder and the president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. That's at fff.org. And of course, he's the publisher of their monthly journal, The Future of Freedom. Welcome back. How are you doing, Jacob?
Doing great. Always been good to be back with you, Scott. Enjoy our exchanges.
Yeah. No, it's a good show. I like it. The people seem to like it too. That's what they say in the emails and things like that. And you make it easy because you write so much. There's always plenty to talk with you about. And I think in a decade of interviewing you on my radio shows and so forth, I don't think we've ever talked before about monetary policy. And I really like this article because it's not just, hey, let's talk about gold and that kind of thing, but let's talk about how the American way used to mean sound money. This was part and parcel of, this is part of why I think you always sing such a libertarian song about America in the 19th century with, of course, all the usual caveats. But you like to talk about how, this is really our heritage. You could come from the right or the left, from Maine or from Southern California or anything else. And this is supposed to be what we're about, freedom. This isn't supposed to be some fringe ideology. This is supposed to be Americanism. And even on the money, even when it comes to precious metals for the money. So dive in, talk to us about what happened at the Constitutional Convention. What does Article 1, Section 8 say about the power of the Congress over the money and its value?
Yeah, well, first of all, your point about the caveats is important, and let's just address those briefly. That we're not ever saying, libertarians aren't saying, hey, the 19th century America was a perfect libertarian paradise. I mean, we all know it wasn't. You had slavery, you had land grants to the railroads, you had corporatism. So that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that the American people brought into existence the most unusual governmental system in history. I mean, it was absolutely an amazing system. Granted, it applied only to a section of society, but it gave us the guiding light as to what's possible. And of course, that meant no welfare state, no Social Security, no Medicare, no Medicaid, no income tax, no IRS, no immigration controls, no military-industrial complex, no CIA, NSA, warfare state, foreign empire of military bases, domestic military bases, empire. I mean, so it was a very unusual system. But at the center of this, no central bank too, at the center of this is the most unusual monetary system in history. That here you had, remember that the Constitution calls the federal government into existence. And as part of calling it into existence, it says, here are your powers. And why did it do that? It was because Americans didn't trust government. When they called the Constitution, the Constitutional Convention, they thought they were just going to amend the Articles of Confederation that Americans had been operating under for some 13 years. And all of a sudden they proposed this central government, this federal government with the power to tax. And so people were very leery. So they said, well, look, this is going to be a government of limited enumerated powers. If it's not listed, you can't do it. Well, as part of this, it gave the federal government the power to coin money. And it did not give the power to print money. So that's an important distinction, because in order to determine whether the federal government has a particular power, we go and look at the list of enumerated powers. So there's no power to print money, but there is a power to coin money. Now, obviously, coining money means making coins, which meant gold and silver coins. I mean, that was the money of the time, precious metals. Of course, this was before computers and so forth. So what they did was they brought into existence a monetary system that was based on gold coins and silver coins. Now, it wasn't a total free market system, which we libertarians would favor, like Hayek pointed out in his essay, The Denationalization of Money. This was government-issued money. But what was fascinating about it was that for the first time in history, the government was not using this power to plunder and loot people through inflation. In the olden days, like they would take coins, the king would, and he would shave off the edges when people would pay their taxes. And so what was previously a 1 ounce coin was now a 9/10 ounce coin, and he'd take the shavings and make a new coin out of them. None of that went on in America from 1791, when the Constitution calls the government into existence, all the way up to the 1930s. Now, one more point, and then I'll turn it back over to you, is that we often hear the term the gold standard. And people have been inculcated with the belief that that meant paper money backed by gold. Totally false. There was no paper money. There were instruments of indebtedness, like, we owe the people money, like a bond. But what was owed was the gold and silver coins. Everybody understood that the gold coins and the silver coins were the official money of the United States. And so you had debt instruments promising to pay people those amounts of money. So now, at the same time, I'll make one more point. The Constitution prohibited the states from issuing paper money. That was what was called bills of credit. So the states were expressly prohibited in the Constitution from doing that. And they were also prohibited from making anything but gold coins and silver coins legal tender, which meant official money. So yeah, the 19th century was a century of sound money. It was an incredible century. It really was one of the major contributing factors to the rise of the tremendous rise of the standard of living of the American people compared to all other people in the world. Was sound money, along with no income tax. People were free to keep everything they earned, no welfare state. And so that system, of course, no longer exists. It went out of existence in the 1930s. But we're really still living off the benefits of that system in an indirect way, in terms of the tremendous standard of living that Americans still enjoy, despite the welfare state and the income tax and the central bank.
All right. Well, so let's fast forward to the 20th century in a minute, but let's stick with the 19th for a moment here. What about the second bank of the United States and all the different fights over the central bank throughout the 19th century? Andrew Jackson and his pet state banks and his war against Nicholas Biddle, or was it Francis Biddle? One of them's the modern day warmonger. One of them was the central banker back then. I always mix them up. Anyway, so talk about that. Talk about Hamilton's scheme to create a central bank, because this was part of what they fought over in the first Washington administration, right? Jefferson resigned over this.
Yeah, but it wasn't a central bank in the way that we know it today, where you have the government planning in a top-down fashion the monetary activities of the entire citizenry. This was a national bank that was owned by the federal government, that would transact its own business. I mean, it was like a government-owned bank, but it wasn't. It would do the ordinary, customary things that banks would do. And of course, we would oppose that as libertarians. We'd say there's absolutely no reason for the government to be running a bank. But it wasn't a central bank in the sense that it controlled all other banks, that it required reserve requirements, that it regulated what the other banks were doing. It was simply a government bank. And there was a debate, obviously, over whether that bank was necessary, and it came into existence for a while, but it didn't stay around very long. Through most of the 19th century, it was just a system of private banking with federally government-issued gold coins and silver coins.
And now, wait a minute. Did I get that right about that was part of the reason that Jefferson resigned as Secretary of State? So it's been a long time since I read this, so I wasn't sure that was right.
You got me. I have no idea. That very well may be the case. But
right. Well, I'll go ahead and retract it until I know I'm right, because it's been a long time, but I thought that was part of it. Anyway, all right, now what real difference does it make? Because seriously, unless you're some kind of ridiculous Austro-libertarian wonk type, who cares what the money's made out of? It has George Washington on it. Why is that? Isn't that more convenient than carrying around a piece of metal in my pocket and all this? So you seem to think people were better off in the 19th century having metal money. Why? Exactly.
Well, if you look throughout history, governments have been the instrument of plunder and looting people. That was one of the major reasons why people have remained mired in poverty throughout the ages, is that government just would confiscate people's money. The king would say, I need money to finance my foreign wars. Like the British king would say, I got a war against France, these endless wars that that Europe and England would be engaged in, and he'd say, okay, I need money to pay the soldiers and buy the weapons. So he'd go out and just seize people's property. Well, that doesn't make people real happy. That kind of thing foments rebellions and revolts. So they figured out a better way to plunder and loot people was through inflation. And this was before the printing press was invented. As I said, they would do that by shaving the edges off the coins that would come into the realm, and then re-put them back into the marketplace with less gold in them, and then they take the shavings and melt them down. But gradually the value of those coins, as they were shrinking in the marketplace, would be less than what the assigned value was. People would start discounting them. And which obviously made the king very upset, that hey, you're not supposed to do this. And that's when you start getting legal tender laws where the king is saying you have to accept these coins at face value. Well, the printing press comes along, and this was big government's biggest dream, because now they said, well, we're going to make paper money the official money of the realm. And now they didn't have to worry about, shaving the edges off coins or that type of thing. They just start printing the money out, and they need to pay salaries, print a batch of money, go pay them that way. And what would happen is the value of everybody's money would diminish. And the advantage to the government, to the king in this instance, is that people wouldn't understand what was happening. That devaluation in money would be reflected in the prices rising of everything, because when the value of your money is dropping, the only way that's going to be reflected is rising prices of everything else. And when that would happen, people would blame it on big business, or the greedy profiteers, or the speculators, or the middlemen, not realizing that it was government behind this. So along comes this system that the United States has, and has sound money, gold coins, silver coins. There's no shaving. There's no paper money at all. All of a sudden, this provides tremendous stability for business. I mean, there were railroads and big corporations in the 19th century that were actually issuing 100-year bonds. And people were buying those bonds. They weren't worried about what the value of the bonds would be in 100 years from now, because they were tied to gold, and people felt confident that those gold bonds would be just as valuable 100 years from now as they would be when they were issued. And so that created tremendous economic stability. Businesses could plan better. People had comfort in putting their money into savings, into corporate bonds, government bonds, because it was all going to be payable in gold coins. Now, what happens is that in 1913, the central bank comes into existence. This is the Federal Reserve System. They claimed, oh, well, this is to keep the value of money secure and solid, and because there had been monetary crises during the 19th century that usually didn't last very long. And so they bring the central bank into existence, and so people are not thinking, oh, well, this is going to be the onslaught of inflation now. This is the new debasement, because the government's still constrained. It can't issue too many paper currencies, paper money, or debt instruments with the central bank, because people might come and demand to be paid in gold coins, because that's the way the bonds were issued. All of a sudden, the Roosevelt administration comes into office in 1932. By this time, the stock market crashed in 1929, due precisely to Federal Reserve manipulation of the money supply. That's another thing we're not taught in our public schools. We're taught it was the failure of free enterprise that brought on the stock market crash. No, it was the Federal Reserve over-contracting the money supply at the end of the 1920s. So Roosevelt comes into existence and does one of the most bizarre, the most revolutionary things that has ever happened in American history. He simply says Americans will no longer be permitted to own gold. Now, this was the constitutional money. The Constitution provides a method by which you can change your system, and that's through constitutional amendment. Roosevelt didn't do that. He simply says, I hereby declare it illegal, supported by Congress, to own gold coins, to hold gold coins. Everybody was required to send their gold coins into the federal government on pain of a felony conviction. If you got caught holding gold coins, which had been the official money, you got prosecuted for a felony and you were subject to a 10-year jail sentence. Most Americans sent their gold coins in. It wasn't worth the risk to them. And people were shell-shocked from the Depression. There was this deference to authority mindset. Very few people questioned it. But it was really no different from, say, what Fidel Castro did when he took over in Cuba and nationalized American businesses. That Roosevelt nationalized people's gold coins. And so once that happened, that opened up the floodgates for government printing the money, because now these Federal Reserve notes, they still promised to pay money, but they were irredeemable. You couldn't go in and demand to be paid in gold because to own gold was illegal. So you had these paper notes flooding the marketplace. Now, what did this do? This enabled the federal government to start running deficits, to start spending out the gazoo for both the welfare state and then after the 40s, the warfare state. They went out borrowing money, excess amounts of money, the type of thing you see today. And now there were no constraints because, again, people couldn't go in and demand to be paid in gold. And this was the onslaught of the inflationary era of America, which ran from the 30s all the way to the present day. That government would run huge deficits and go and borrow the money, and then the Federal Reserve would accommodate the debt by simply, effectively, it's a complicated process, but they would print the money to pay off that excess debt. And that leads us to where we are today, where you have this system where even silver coins, which were not illegal, have been run out of circulation. It's Gresham's law that bad money will always drive out good money. They made cheap alloyed coins that not worth anything except the face value. You've got legal tender laws that require people to accept these the paper money. And we don't know where this is headed, but there's a lot of people that are saying this is headed in a very bad direction. You've got massive government debt. You've got massive unfunded entitlements that are going to have to be paid, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. They continue to run huge deficits. They continue to raise the debt ceiling. Nobody's calling for reductions in government spending. And in meantime, the Fed is propping up this thing with a huge bubble. I mean, this is the biggest bubble they have ever done because it's quantitative easing has gone on for many years now at zero interest rates. And when that bubble bursts, I think you're going to see a crisis the likes of which Americans cannot even imagine.
All right, well, I want to go back to that pre-Fed era there, not the 19th century, but say the very early 20th, where you had these panics, which were caused by speculative bubbles that were created with, expanded bank credit, right? Loans that people were bidding up the value of these or those notes. And these crises that were then used to justify the creation of the central bank, they were basically just, instead of the central bank making that impossible, they just institutionalized it. They just made it permanent and entered into their combine with the central government itself. So where it used to be JP Morgan was the central bank, and if he wanted to bail you out, he could, and he was the guy generating the bubbles to a great degree, I guess, anyway. But if you couldn't get him to decide to bail out your Knickerbocker trust or whatever, then it wasn't going to get bailed out. But then once you put Uncle Sam, aka the American people, on the hook for it to be the lender of last resort, then there's institutionalize the very worst aspect of the economy that they claim that they're fixing. Now, when you're talking about the biggest bubble ever, here we are, we're a century later now, where each government intervention has necessitated the next intervention. You talk about the Great Depression and how then that led to all the big government reaction, even though it was the central bank that had caused it in the first place. And then, of course, all the spending and the creation of the national security state during the Cold War and the welfare state as well during this whole time. And I got to tell you, when I hear you or well, we could go back to that if you want to address that pre-Fed era, but to bring it back to right now, when I hear you or Ron Paul or Charles Goyette or any of these libertarians saying that, hey, listen, this is the big bubble here, I got to tell you, you're the only ones who are saying that or care. And the entire political class, Jacob, thinks, whatever, we can just continue running deficits as high as we want. We can run up the national debt as high as we want. The only thing stopping us is the ceiling, and all we have to do is raise that, and we'll just keep on quantitative easing, and we'll just keep on spending, and there's no reason to believe that it'll ever end. So I guess if you want, address the old days and then come back to why they're really wrong about that, you figure.
Yeah, I've read some Austrian economists that say that those panics in the 19th century were actually due to government intervention. And I forget who it was, which one of the Austrians said that, but it was a fascinating argument. I can't repeat it because it was kind of complicated, but it's intriguing that he was attributing that to government intervention and not the free market.
Well, it was certainly fractional reserve banking that was doing it, whether it was ultimately backed by a government backstop or not. It was artificial bank credit expansion, just like in Rothbard 101. This is what causes bubbles.
Yeah. Now, I would argue that there's absolutely nothing wrong with fractional reserve banking. And what we're talking about with fractional reserve banking is where a government is making, a private bank is making more loans than they have the reserves of gold to justify. And the rationale is that, look, and the depositors of gold are not all going to rush in and demand their gold. So we can issue loans out here and make money off these loans with the assumption that maybe at any particular time, 15% of the depositors will be demanding their money. Now, if all of a sudden all the depositors come in and say, we want our money, then that's when the gig's up and the bank's going to go under for doing that. So banks have every incentive in the world to reach the right balance. Is it safe to do, expand by 20% or 30%? But and there's libertarians that say, well, there should be a law that says 100% reserves, that this is fraud. Well, it's not fraud, because if every customer knows what that bank's policy is, and presumably that would be the case.
Well, that's not really the question. The question is, does it lead to bubbles or not?
Well, yeah, but on a very limited basis. Because
that's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying. Then they went, look, a very limited basis type bubble. Let's create a central bank.
Absolutely. But you see, if a bank goes under, to me, it's just like investing in the wrong stock.
Sure.
You invest in the wrong stock, it goes under, you lose your money. It shouldn't make any difference with respect to banks. The same principle applies. You research the bank. If it's expanding its loans to a larger degree, you're going to get paid higher interest. You take your chances. You want a safer bank, then you go to the one that's not doing that. And so, then they bring in the Federal Reserve saying, oh, well, we're going to stabilize all this. But as you point out, they institutionalize it. And it was really just a con. It was really to accommodate what the government wanted to do in terms of massive out of control spending to fund what was really coming, the welfare state. That's Roosevelt brings into existence Social Security. And then later Johnson, his protege, brings in Medicare. And then you got this great outburst of spending for the welfare state, foreign aid, and then the warfare state, the foreign empire, the military industrial complex. And so, what we're saying is they've been doing this decade after decade after decade. And each time they'll play their little games of, oh, well, we got to impose price controls because inflation's here and we have no control over this. Or they'll lower interest rates down to zero. And each time they do this, they've been able to get out of it through this artificial monetary expansion. But that's not real wealth. All they do is they send wrong signals to people in the business community. They send signals that say, hey, there's prosperity here, start expanding, start hiring people. And then at some point, as we've seen time and time again, the bubble bursts and there's massive unemployment. Businesses are going under. And this time, to get out of the last crisis, the bubble is much bigger. And so, some of us are saying, this time they may not be able to get out of this thing. It may be a real monetary crisis, financial crisis, economic crisis. And with all the types of things you see in Latin American countries where this goes on, like capital controls, seizure of retirement accounts to fund the government, you never know what's going to happen in terms of an emergency. Now, there's another factor here that I want to mention, and that's the banking system itself, Scott, that ever since the 1930s, when banks have gone under, they have not been permitted to go under. They're simply absorbed into another bank. And sometimes it's by mandate, where the Fed just walks in and says, you're closed, you're now part of this bank, and there's a forced sale. But we all know that in a market economy, when businesses fail, there's a reason. There's weakness there. They deserve to fail. Here, for umpteen decades, the government has been absorbing these weak banks instead of just letting them go. So you've got the FDIC where it says, oh, well, we're going to guarantee everybody's deposits in case your bank goes under. And notice they keep raising that. Every so often they raise that to give people confidence that, oh, your money's okay. But what happens if there's a nationwide banking collapse where the whole banking industry goes into crisis? How are they going to pay all the depositors off? Where do they get the money to do that? Well, there's only two ways. One is to tax everybody, which doesn't make much sense, to go tax me $100,000 so they can pay me my $100,000 in deposits. Or more likely, what they're going to do is print the money. And then that's where you've got the hyperinflation problem. And so that's what's built into this system now, is not only these bubbles, but you've got a highly unstable, weakened banking industry that has been weakened by what they've been doing for decades now.
Mm. Well, and it seems like if they ever really give up and say, man, the inflation is causing such a problem, we've got to raise interest rates and put a pause on this. Let's get back to generating a new bubble in a little while. But for right now, we need to have a recession and wipe out these bad debts. Well, they can't do it because the national debt is so high now that if you raise the interest rate to even a few percent, then that's the entire national budget for the year is just to pay the interest on the debt. So then at that point, they have to completely default. Am I wrong about that?
You hit the nail on the head. They are really facing, they're in a crack as things progress. Now, right now, everything looks like hunky-dory. To me, it's sort of like being in the eye of the hurricane, wherever the sun's out and everything's fine.
Yeah, I was going to say, you live near D.C., where all the buildings say, Northrop Grumman and government contractor wealth on the side of them. It's kind of different out here.
Oh yeah, no, we're kind of booming over here because of all the government money that y'all send us, and I want to thank you for that. Really appreciate doing that. But notice that they've kept interest rates at zero for how many years now? And what has it accomplished? I mean, this one's what's fascinating is that in the old days they could lower interest rates, and all of a sudden this artificial monetary expansion would get the economy going again. Mm-hmm. For the first time, this hasn't worked. And so they've kept it low at zero for years now. And when this thing finally grabs, my hunch is that you're going to have a very rapid balloon that's filling up real fast, and they're not going to know what to do with it because they start raising interest rates and start contracting the money supply. At that point, it may just be too late, where you lose control over these things sometimes. Look at Greece. I mean, that's your prime example of what happens to a government that overspends. Now, their situation was significantly different because they can't print the money to get out of their problems. The Germans won't let them do that. But the Fed here, the U.S. officials, know they've got an out, that if things go the way of Greece, they'll just start opening up the spigots and start spending the money. But, as you point out, will it do any good? I mean, that's what's really fascinating about this thing. Mm-hmm. We don't know.
I heard Ron Paul on talk radio in probably 1997 or 1998 warning about this kind of thing. And the guy asked Ron Paul, well, what about all the old people depending on Social Security, Ron? Are they still going to get their checks? And Ron said, oh, yeah, they'll still get their checks, but they'll be worthless.
Oh, yeah. It'd be like
check,
Germany.
You'd be able to buy, one piece of fruit with it, but you'll get your check.
Yeah, it's like in Germany where people were taking wheelbarrows of money, paper money in to buy a loaf of bread. Yeah. And where prices were like doubling in every hour. But this, look, Scott, it's important that we recognize that this is the consequence of the entire welfare warfare state apparatus, that this is what's bankrupting our country. And that's what people need to question. It's not enough to say audit the Fed or get rid of the Fed, or you got to look at this thing in the overall context of what Americans did in the 20th century when they abandoned the founding principles of this country. We started out the show talking about this glimmer of light for a certain segment of American society. that light was extinguished in the 1930s and the early 1920s with the welfare warfare state. And the only ones that are holding that light up now are us libertarians. I mean, we have the way out of this. This is what's kind of fascinating. We have the way out. Now, one more thing about this. When the crisis comes, now, and we libertarians can't predict when it's going to come. We can just tell you it's going to come. That watch what they say. They're going to say this. They're going to blame it on free enterprise. And they're going to say, what do you libertarians say is the way out of this? What's the way to fix the crisis? Well, we don't fix crises that are produced by statism. We set the foundations for a free society, and we say, if you want a free society, this is what you need to do now. Dismantle the welfare state, dismantle the warfare state. But when the crisis comes and everything's going to hell in a handbasket, don't come to us and say, well, gosh, you libertarians are not practical because you won't show us how to fix these problems.
Well, the market will take care of it. I mean, that's the whole point. Just let people who don't cash government checks figure it out. Stand out of the way and it'll be all right. That's my position. All right, well, listen, we're out of time. We're going to have to talk about Russia and Guantanamo and all these other things on the next show, which will be the week after next because we're skipping next week's show. But week after next, we'll be back. Oh, and then, well, we're doing it on a Wednesday or a Friday because of Thanksgiving, something like that. Anyway, we'll let you know. Just follow our Twitter feeds, everybody, and you'll see. Thank you very much, Jacob.
Thanksgiving's later anyway. We will be here.
We got one more week before Thanksgiving.
Right,
yeah,
we'll be here the week after next.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, well, thanks very much, everybody. See you a week after next then.
Okay, thanks, Scott. Enjoyed the show.
Me too. See ya.